Hi. Okay, we're going to talk about Joseph Conrad this week, and my subtitle should let you know how I feel about his work. I think that it represents late Victorian literature, but I think it also represents the beginning of modernist literature in terms of its ambiguity and its sort of sense of disarray and the sort of impending sense of something being wrong with imperialism. So let's talk about Heart of Darkness. First, I think we need to talk about the ambiguity at the heart of this novel because it really remains unresolved. So you could say that topics are rich in the novel. Just some of those might include trade and exploration, imperialism and colonialism, race relations, the role of gender in imperialist horrors, darkness of the subconscious mind, seafaring, and so on. You could go on and on. But the trick is, all of these, given the nature of the novel, can be viewed differently according to your theoretical perspective or your historical perspective. So they were probably seen quite differently by Victorian readers who were very familiar with Gothic tales like Jekyll and Hyde, which you've just read. And certainly by contemporary readers, they are seen much more as an indictment of imperialist atrocities than they would have been seen by Victorians, who were steeped in imperialism. And if they were ambivalent about it, it was just a sort of vague ambivalence for the majority of people. That sort of horror at imperialism and its excesses came with a modernist era. It didn't, in the Victorian era, it was just a nascent feeling. Another thing that adds to the ambiguity of the meaning in this tale is the fact that the two narrators, and I'll talk about why there's two, are both unreliable. First, there's a frame narrative, and Marlowe's tale, which is the sort of primary narrative, is included within that. So that is a tale within a tale. And the frame narrator is not named. He's a member of the boating party that is on the Thames when Charlie Marlowe starts to tell his tale. And so he's relating essentially from memory Marlowe's tale. So both his memory is going to be questionable and then Marlowe's ability to remember the experiences. So as Marlowe begins to tell his tale, the unnamed narrator sets the scene, and he also shapes our impression of Marlowe. But we have to ask who he is, and we don't know. And so we have to wonder if we can trust his descriptions. So, for example, he reveals himself as a thoroughly dedicated imperialist when he describes the Thames River. And this is in the Norton on page 1000. He says, "What greatness had not floated on the ebb of that river into the mystery of an unknown earth? The dreams of men, the seed of commonwealths, the germs of empires." And so clearly, he's embracing imperialism, at least in his tone here, and there's no reason for us to think that he's ironic. Whereas we'll find that Marlowe has some ambivalence about imperialism, if not British imperialism, at least Belgian imperialism. He also casts doubt on Marlowe when he describes him. Just a few of the things he does that cast doubt on him is he claims that Marlowe didn't represent his class. And also he points out that his tales don't have clear meanings, which is what he expects of men of Marlowe's class and profession. So we can't trust that narrator. At least we should be suspicious of him. But also we don't know who Charlie Marlowe is really. And he's the principal narrator of the story within the story, of the real tale that takes up most of the pages. He's like the ancient mariner in Coleridge's poem in his storytelling skills. However, he's not like the mariner in that he doesn't seem to have a moral position or a lesson to teach us. And here's what the frame narrator tells us. He says, "The yarns of seamen have a direct simplicity, the whole meaning of which lies within the shell of a cracked nut. But Marlowe was not typical, and to him the meaning of an episode was not inside like a kernel." And that quote goes on to talk about how it's on the outside like a glow, a haze, and again we get into a sort of symbolism that has no clear meaning. What we do know about Marlowe doesn't help us understand him too much. We know that he's a white middle-class imperialist male of the 19th century. That is, he's got all the baggage of the Victorian era. In fact, his quarrel is less with colonialism in general than with the atrocious Belgian variety. And in fact, he's often condescending towards the Africans in this tale. So, for example, this passage reveals his contempt with the Belgians. He said, these chaps were not much account, really. They were no colonists. Their administration was merely a squeeze or a robbery, and nothing more, I suspect. They were conquerors, and for that you want only brute force. It was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a great scale. So he's clearly condemning the Belgians, but it's not clear that he feels that, say, British imperialism is aberrant. So one way, there's been several ways actually that scholars have tried to make sense of Marlowe's tale. Some argue that it is in general an indictment of European imperialism and possibly even European slavery and racism. Others argue that it's an indictment only of King Leopold in Belgium and what the atrocities that were at that point becoming clear to the world. Or the 20th century African novelist Chinua Achebe argues that Conrad was a thoroughgoing racist. And I urge you to take a look at that essay. It's very persuasive. But he would then argue that Marlowe's not doing us much of a anti-imperialist, anti-racist service. So let's look at one way we can maybe start to get meaning out of this tale, and that is by looking at it as an example of the monomyth. And the monomyth is a sort of a exploration of the hero's journey. The Arthurian quest is another example of this kind of journey, although Joseph Campbell, who named it the monomyth, goes back much earlier to find examples of this generic sort of tale. And it includes many stages, at least in Campbell's description. Not all of them have to be present for it to be a hero's journey or a monomyth, but they would include these: birth, and usually those are either in fabulous circumstances or in the more modernist versions of the tale, it would be a sort of common birth who's led to some form of greatness reluctantly. There's the call to adventure. Again, a hero can accept that like an Arthurian knight might accept it with great honor, or he can accept it reluctantly. And when we look at T.S. Eliot, if we were to look at The Wasteland, we would see that his hero accepts it reluctantly. There are helpers, often helpers who offer an amulet or some sort of a protective tool. There's the moment of crossing the threshold when the hero must go from one world into the world of adventure. And then the hero has to face many tests, which he must overcome in order to continue toward the resolution of his journey. He'll encounter helpers along the way. Some of them might be quite otherworldly. Ultimately, there'll be a climax or a final battle. And this is the critical moment of the journey that facilitates the resolution of the adventure. And after that, there will be a flight, again, back towards the threshold, at the point at which the hero must return and cross the threshold, bringing in the elixir. That could be an object or knowledge or a blessing that can help to heal the world that he has come from, or home. So could we see Marlowe as a reluctant hero on a quest? He sets off on a strange adventure. He's a bit like a knight or a hero in that he's frequently tested. We see the tests carrying with it signs. For example, the women knitting black wool in Belgium before he leaves on his journey. We could just say, oh, well, they're just company personnel, but possibly they sort of stand as guards to gateway to a mysterious underworld. Or there are many other signs that we might consider. The first station with its barrels of unused rivets and the needless blasting of a cliff and the making of a railroad. This could be seen as a test or a sign that Marlowe has to interpret or overcome. The central station with its manager and the brickmaker and all the little figures that occur there and the horrors that occur there. What does Marlowe make of this, and is this a test as part of his journey? Other signs you could consider are the Russian, who's kind of a Shakespearean fool who has an ambivalent and possibly even homosexual relationship to Kurtz, or the gateposts that become heads-on poles at Kurtz's at the third station. What does this represent, and is it a sign? Is it a test that Marlowe must face? And even before he sets out, there's all kinds of omens. I mentioned the women knitting in the Belgian office. There's the phrenologist who's measuring Marlowe's skull and warning of changes that will come, or the tale of how his predecessor died in a dispute over hens. All of these things could be taken as signs or tests that he must interpret. And then you need to consider whether within the monomyth or simply in reading this tale, the themes. There are several repeated themes, three of which come sort of again and again to my mind. One is the evil and hypocrisy at the heart of the Belgian imperial enterprise. That's just repeated over and over. Another is the loss of a moral center in a modern world of political and economic expansion. So that's sort of the larger picture. But it's repeated over and over, and we're reminded to think about that. Or there's a larger question of a man cut free from social constraints of his civilized life and the madness that results, and that's seen most obviously by Kurtz, but it also is seen in Marlowe. So you could say that any one of these is the ill of the modern world that Marlowe, as the reluctant hero, must heal by procuring the elixir, and that could be knowledge that he can bring back to heal the modern world, if you want to read it as part of a monomyth. In any case, however you read it, there are other important symbols that you'll want to consider as you read this tale. Some of those are an obscuring haze or fog that comes up over and over, and you need to think about what implications it has for your interpretation of the novel. Kurtz's painting, or the repetition of opposites, dark, light, inside, outside, civilization or savagery. The accountant, I think, is another symbol. The whited sepulchre, which is the Belgian city. Ivory, women. There are many others. So all of these can help us as we try to make sense of this novel. And then finally, I would just say, trying to make sense of it will, for us, be situated in a historical moment. So we need to remember that we look back on imperialism and racism and have perhaps the benefit of hindsight, which Conrad didn't have. But did he have some intent or some insight that we can glean from either reading this as a hero's journey or by interpreting it in other ways? So I posed some questions about this and about the ambiguous narrators that I hope you'll be able to engage on the discussion board, and I look forward to your responses. Thanks.